Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Horace Anderson, Dean of the Elisabeth Haub School of Law, and I want to thank you for coming to our virtual celebration of Haub Law faculty scholarly work. The focus of our conversation today is going to be Menstruation Matters by Professors Bridget Crawford and Emily Waldman, but we're going to be having a wide-ranging conversation today in which various members of our faculty connect with and discuss this work in relation to their own scholarly field. So we're looking forward to an exciting conversation. So this is a bit of an unusual book launch, so to speak, in part because we're talking about more than just the authors of the book and having a broader conversation, but also because the book isn't quite being launched yet, but you can pre-order the book at nyupress.org. And there is a discount for being a participant in this program. So you can use the discount code there on your screen. The publication date is June 21st, so you'll have it before you know it. I want to take a moment to note that we are very proud at Haub Law to have made menstrual products available for free in our school bathrooms. We're going to hear a lot today about how important that is, how crucial that is in making sure that everyone can fully participate in educational opportunities and really in opportunities beyond the campus. We're so grateful to all of the students, faculty, and staff who brought this issue to the forefront and made it happen. And one last thank you before we start to hear from our panelists. Thank you to our entire library staff. Everything we do as a community, students and faculty in the realm of scholarship is made possible by their work. So thank you so much. And looking forward to seeing the fruits of the library support in today's discussion. So first, I'm going to turn the microphone over to our authors. We're going to hear from them about the genesis of this project and how it developed. So turning it over now to Professors Crawford and Waldman.
Thank you so much, Dean Anderson, and our colleagues who are going to speak later are welcome to take a break off camera for the moment. I wanted to say how this book came about. I had originally been working on a project involving taxation and human rights. In what way is tax a human rights issue? And learned that in many states in the United States, there is a sales tax on menstrual products. Tampons and pads are subject to a sales tax. People call that the tampon tax for short. When analogous products in many jurisdictions, like bandages or gauze, or not quite analogous products like Viagra or Rogaine or condoms, are not subject to tax. And I wrote about that with a colleague at Oklahoma City University, Carla Spivak, and wrote about the tampon tax as a human rights issue. One of our traditions at Pace Law School is over the summer and during the school year, we are engaged in active dialogue with each other and either informally or formally have presentations. And I think during a summer presentation, I was presenting this work to a group of PACE colleagues about the tampon tax and human rights issues. And I was talking about how in 4 jurisdictions in the United States, advocates were bringing class action litigation alleging that the tampon tax, the sales tax on menstrual products, was unconstitutional. And sitting in the audience were my many colleagues who asked thoughtful and interesting questions, and I took notes. And one of the colleagues at that session was my now co-author, Emily Waldman, who asked at the time, well, precisely what are the arguments people are advancing that this tax is unconstitutional? Now, being a tax scholar, I didn't have a good handle on the arguments. To make a long story short, that one summer session, that sharing of our ideas and scholarly community led us to write one article about the constitutional arguments, leading to other articles, because once we started looking at the constitutional issues surrounding taxation of menstrual products, we discovered the many, many ways that law intersects with menstruation. So I'll turn it over to Emily Waldman to talk a little bit more about what this book is that we developed from that one presentation over the summer. But it really started out as a tax project, morphed into much, much bigger investigation.
Thanks so much, Bridget. So I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about the book. As Bridget mentioned, we first wrote an article about the constitutionality of the tampon tax, and that led us into other articles. For example, we looked at Title IX, which is a statute that prohibits sex discrimination in education, and we started thinking about whether under that, schools need to provide menstrual products to students who couldn't afford them. But I think what is different and exciting about our book is that each of our articles really takes up a specific legal question. Our book is able to take a much bigger picture view. We look, first of all, at culture surrounding menstruation, stigma and silence. And then we really look at menstrual advocacy at multiple levels. So one thing we get to do in our book that we really didn't do in our articles is we tell the stories of who is working on these issues. How did they get into them? Which specific areas of menstruation and the law, menstrual advocacy, did they focus on? What techniques did they use? How did they do it? So we tell the story sort of at the ground level of what is really happening and why is it working? And we get into social media and things like that. So sort of the political campaign aspect of this. We also then do look at the same sorts of doctrinal legal questions that we look at in our articles, right? So what does the law say? What arguments can be made? What can both sides say when they're trying to think about how menstruation interacts with the law? But again, by putting it in this broader context, I think it makes it much more accessible to readers. Finally, in addition to just looking at the stories, who's working on this and why, what strategies are they using, and looking at it at the doctrinal level of what legal arguments can be made, the third thing we do is try to think bigger picture, more normatively, like here are the arguments that can be made right now under the different laws, but then also think about, well, what new laws are needed? What are the kinds of issues that law can address? What are the issues that it's really not so much a place for law to address, but more about other cultural or social changes? So we hope that when people read the whole book, they really have the full 360-degree picture. And it made it a lot of fun for us to work on too, I think, really bringing these issues to life. We saw in a new way how all of the articles fit together. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dean Anderson so we can start hearing from our colleagues about different aspects of the book that resonated with them and with their own research and experiences.
Thank you both. I think it's great that this project came out of conversations with colleagues around an idea, and now we're circling back to some of those same colleagues as they react from the perspective of their fields to the articles in the book. So we're going to start with Professor Noah Ben-Asher to give her remarks.
So thank you, Dean Anderson, and congratulations, Professor Waldman and Crawford. So my remarks will be brief, and I wanted to say that this book offers a really important intervention in a broader context, a broader debate on social justice. It tells us that menstruation in terms of law and policy matter, and it seeks to challenge the law's silence on periods, as we see from its very, from the title of the book. I want to underscore an important connection that the authors make between gender identity and reproductive justice. In a chapter entitled Men Who Menstruate, the authors recognize wisely that reproductive freedoms overlap in important ways with gender freedom. They discuss feminist debates on that point, and they acknowledge that men who menstruate exist and deserve our attention, and so do non-binary folks who menstruate. And in that sense, this chapter is an important contribution to a broader debate that is currently going on in society. This book will be published at a time when a key constitutional right on which women have relied on for half a century now will be taken away. It will also be published at a time when transgender and non-binary youth and children are being hassled, demonized, and scrutinized by the same states that will and do plan to ban abortion. So that connection that the authors make is now being played out and will be played out in real life in this country as reproductive rights get scaled back. And in my own work, and also reflecting on this book, the point that I wanted to flag here is that we are deep in a debate about equality and about freedom in this country under the 14th Amendment, as we will see in the decision that comes up, that this will be a question about the due process clause and about whether the equal protection clause applies or not, and about freedoms. But I want to say that the big picture that we're really talking about and we really must stay focused on is that these are questions of morality and they're questions of ideology. And the law is important here in how we address the issues, but we must remember that we are in this together, as the authors point, and we have to look out for all the minorities that will suffer as a result of this moral war on our rights. And so I thank you all for this intervention. It comes at a really important time, and I hope that a lot of people will pick up the book and pay attention to it.
Thank you, Professor Ben Asher, for those comments. And next, we're going to hear from Professor Katie Q with her thoughts on the importance of the book.
I'd like to start by congratulating Professors Waldman and Crawford, and also thanking them for their incredible generosity by giving us this opportunity to build on their insights in menstruation matters. In Chapter 7 of Menstruation Matters, focused on menstruation, health, and the environment, Professors Crawford and Waldman carefully document how and why menstruators are regularly and unknowingly exposed to numerous chemicals with unknown health effects. Tampons and pads sit flush against menstruators' vaginal and vulvar membranes, which can absorb chemicals more quickly than other parts of the body. And although we lack clear and comprehensive knowledge about the constituents of tampons and pads, haphazard spot checks done by advocacy groups and sometimes government agencies over the years have revealed the presence of an astounding number of chemicals, including multiple known carcinogens, neurotoxins, and endocrine disruptors. These include phthalates, volatile organic compounds, tributyl phosphate, chloroform, chloroethane, styrene, malaoxone, malathion, diclofluanide, mecarbam, proximidone, methiothione, fessylfathione, pyrethrum, pyperonal butoxide, and dioxin. Despite the documented presence of these chemicals in tampons and pads, no U.S. laws require manufacturers to affirmatively demonstrate product safety or even to reveal all of the chemicals in their products. Professors Crawford and Waldman persuasively connect the silence about the potential harm associated with the use of menstrual products to long-standing cultural attitudes about menstruation. I would add that thinking about this from the perspective of environmental law, we should indeed be very concerned about the harms that lurk in this silence, because there are other pernicious forces obscuring knowledge about or attention to the harms from menstrual products. As a result of grandfathering of chemicals under the Toxic Substances Control Act, we are largely ignorant of the health effects of exposures to many chemicals. We are also wholly ignorant of the effects from exposures to different combinations of chemicals. And we have little reliable knowledge about safe levels of exposure when exposure occurs through contact in the vagina or genital area. Our pervasive ignorance about the health effects of these chemical exposures is not just due to the scientific difficulty of understanding the effects of exposure or the lack of adequate legal requirement. Product manufacturers affirmatively obscure, bend, and slow the development of knowledge about the health effects of their products, as documented powerfully by the scholarship of Wendy Wagner and Thomas McGarity. Professors Waldman and Crawford explained in their book how Procter & Gamble ignored concerns about the use of carboxymethylcellulose in superabsorbent tampons, and that type of conduct is depressingly common. Finally, we should not take solace in the hope that these exposures might be safe. That's because we're already being harmed just by being exposed without knowing whether that exposure is safe. There is a real harm that arises from not knowing the effects of exposures you can't control. The fear, uncertainty, and dread of knowing you have been and will continue to be exposed to chemicals and not knowing what harms may result. That type of fear and dread harm is invisible in most regulatory and cost-benefit analyses. It's another area of silence, but it's pervasive and real. So I applaud the efforts of Professors Crawford and Waldman to replace the silence around the health effects of menstrual products with both awareness and knowledge.
Thank you, Professor Q, for your insights. Next up, we will hear from Professor Thomas Mcdonald. Professor Mcdonald.
Good afternoon. I want to congratulate my friends and colleagues, Professors Crawford and Waldman, for this work. And I also want to thank Professor Crawford for inviting me to participate in this colloquium. Menstruation Matters is a touchstone, a compelling case study sharply illuminating entrenched legal conventions and practices that discriminate on the basis of gender and menstruation. Professor Crawford and Waldman's work lays bare the sheer injustice of stigmatizing and often impeding over half the world's population from fully participating in public life because of a normal bodily function, without which the human race could not go on. The work reminds me of Rosa Parks' refusal to sit at the back of the bus, and in a different context, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Any reasonable person who has the opportunity to read Professor Crawford's and Waldman's book is left with an absolute conviction of the justness of its call. I'm going to talk about their work and how it implies human rights norms. The book quotes Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, the US movement's most vocal proponent, as follows: "Our issues aren't all the same, but whether you're dissecting it by poverty or gender, of any issues that affect things like access, participation, equity, justice, democracy, menstrual equity touches on all these things." I think Ms. Weiss-Wolf was referring to the United States law and practice, but everything she said also refers to international human rights. And I just want to quote for you something, and this all comes from their, again, their outstanding book. They quote the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights as follows: "The stigma and shame generated by stereotypes around menstruation have severe impacts on all aspects of women's and girls' human rights, including their right to equality, health, housing, water, sanitation, education, freedom of religion or belief, safe and healthy working conditions, and to take part in cultural and public life without discrimination." Now, international law, including international human rights law, has extraordinarily strong protections for gender equality. And I think what we see, if we can just go through some of the examples that are just laid out there in the excerpt from the High Commissioner of Human Rights, we can see how this actually works. Okay? And I'd like to first just talk about the right to education. Under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, okay, A right to education is guaranteed. Okay, 171 nations of the world are parties to this convention. Unfortunately, the United States is not one of them, but out of a virtually supermajority of states have recognized this right. And one of the things that this book points out quite eloquently is how discrimination and attitudes towards menstruation has hindered girls' and women's right to an education. It points out in the United States, in developed states as well as in developing countries, okay, a fairly significant percentage of young girls who do not attend school or are absent, okay, when they are menstruating. In some countries of the world, okay, girls, I believe it was India, one study indicated that 28% of the girls actually drop out of school, okay, once they reach puberty. Because of menstruation and the stigma that's attached to menstruation. Other things that are pointed out is not only the question of availability of menstruation products, but in some countries of the world, the stigma against menstruation actually affects young girls from even possibly taking such products. So this is one thing that we have to say just shocks the conscience. How can we tolerate? How can we tolerate any type of society or world which impedes the education of girls and women because of this normal bodily function? Moving on from education, I think we need to talk about the right to health. Likewise, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, okay, guarantees a right to health. They point out that 500 million women in the world, okay, do not have access to clean water and sanitation, access which is critical for menstruation hygiene. Okay? This has enormous effects in terms of the health of women, particularly with regard to vaginal infections and other illnesses. Again, how can we in today's world, really expect to tolerate that type of abuse? Related to this is healthy working conditions, or I should just say working conditions. One study of women in Bangladesh indicated, and this is all in their outstanding book, indicated that that women on average, okay, are absent 6 days a week from work because they don't have access to menstruation products. Again, how can women's life, how can anyone's life be somehow impeded on this? Now, the last point that I would like to, actually is one other area I'd like to touch on, but I don't want to take the thunder from my colleague, Michael Mushland. But the idea that menstruation products are often not made available to women in prisons, okay, I have to say shocks the conscience. It is something that is utterly unacceptable. And I'm sure Michael will deal with that further. But in terms of international human rights, it's a direct violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention Against Torture, both of which do not permit that type of mistreatment of those who are incarcerated. Now, I did want to actually, the one point in international human rights law, there are several that apply here, but one that I did want to emphasize is the idea of discrimination against women because of because of menstruation. And unfortunately, I think we have to say that this applies, not only to developing countries, but to developed countries. I think telling is their example of the former president's ridiculing Megyn Kelly and clearly implying that she was a person of no status because she may have been menstruating. I mean, again, unfortunately, this type of attitude, exists not only in locker rooms but also in boardrooms. Okay, and it is another thing that we, as an international community, have to stamp out. Now, I did also want to talk a little bit about. So this is international human rights law, and the one thing I have to say about international human rights law, international law generally, is that it is law, but in a primitive state of development. There is no international legislature. There is no international court with jurisdiction, okay, over general disputes as we have in domestic institutions, domestic countries. But one thing that international law is actually quite effective at is being a tool to rally and to motivate individuals around the world. For example, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International routinely invoke international human rights law and international humanitarian law in their various campaigns to improve the lot of individuals around the world and to change practices and policies. And what I saw in this book that I found interesting was the invocation of international human rights law, as a means of moving forward this critical movement. I would also add that there are, and the book mentions many of them, there are international tribunals and bodies, okay, that can be used to advance this issue. And I would just like to mention a few of them. The book mentions in some detail the European Court of Human Rights, okay, as being a potential a tribunal that this type of issue could be litigated. I would also mention the European Court of Human Rights, the international human rights bodies that monitor treaties, that is to say, the UN Human Rights Committee, the UN CEDAW, which is the Convention for Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of discrimination against women Committee, the Committee Against Torture, the UN Committee Against Torture, and also the UN Committee for the Rights of the Child. All of these are instruments that I think this movement can use, and the book certainly mentions the possibility of using them. I would also add the UN Human Rights Council as another possible avenue. Now, to quickly turn to the other area, which is comparative law. Well, what are other countries doing on this issue? And I think it's instructive to see that there has been an international effort here, right? And the book really describes it quite interesting and detailed fashion. And I would just like to again point out the example of Scotland, which I know Professor Crawford had mentioned at the first session. But Scotland has really been a leader in this area, okay? And it's providing essentially free products, menstruation products to all individuals who are attending school, okay, which is an enormous step forward, as well as moving forward in other areas as well. I would also like to note, though, Kenya, a developing country, was, as I understand it, the first country to eliminate the tampon tax, which Professor Crawford eloquently spoke about, and also wrote her article. Something, if you haven't read that article, you should read that as well. But despite the challenges, and there were challenges regarding COVID and the like, we could see that developing countries, can make an effort to advance menstruation justice, menstruation equity as well. So I think that suggests to me that this is a movement. This is a movement that I think will become ever and ever stronger. And I have to congratulate my colleagues, okay, for their efforts in doing so. And I just want to quote one quote that they mentioned in a book, to close. And the quote is as follows, and this actually comes from the Human Rights Initiative at the Central European University. All human rights stem from the fundamental right to human dignity. When people who are bleeding every month are forced into seclusion, must use damp and soiled materials, and are treated as second-class citizens, dignity is difficult to maintain. Again, I wish my congratulations. This was a terrific work. Bravo. I encourage everyone who is watching today to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mcdonald. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Michael Mushland.
Thank you, Ed. My thanks to Professor Crawford and Professor Waldman, and my congratulations. Reading chapter 4 of this book is a harrowing experience. In that chapter, you read about the horrible problems that incarcerated women have in obtaining access to menstrual products that are essential for their health and dignity. The people whose stories are told in this book are held in the gulag, that is the American system of prisons and jails. Deprived of their liberty, they must depend on their keepers for all their needs, including the need for menstrual products. As Bridget and Emily write, periods don't stop when someone gets arrested and go to jail. Yet, as they note, that once you're in jail or in prison, you are dependent upon the government to provide anything to you for all essential services, including menstrual products. In chapter 4, Bridget and Emily lift the veil and show how that dependence is rewarded. In chapter 4, we read the stories of women experiencing deprivation of these essential products and reduced to begging guards for additional toilet paper to fashion makeshift menstrual products. In chapter 4, we read about guards on Rikers Island throwing a bag of tampons into the air. And we read about inmates watching the guards watching as inmates dive to the ground to retrieve them. Bridget and Emily call this a degrading spectacle out of the distribution of a basic necessity. In that chapter, we read of prisoners who are paid 40 cents an hour, foregoing phone calls with loved ones so that they can have money to purchase these essential products. In chapter 4, we read about mothers and wives who aren't allowed to visit loved ones because they, the visitors, are having their period. Bridget and Emily candidly call this what it is when they write that prison officials use menstruation as a vector for humiliation and control of prisoners. These are abuses of power. These are reminders of the powerlessness of prisoners and of detainees. I wish I could tell you that I was surprised when I read this harrowing chapter, to read about such upsetting accounts of mistreatment and providing access to menstrual products to women who are imprisoned. But sadly, I can't. American penal facilities are harsh places. They're rife with indifference and abuse. There are exceptions, but by and large, the American prison system does not serve our values or our needs. Every year, to keep my treatise on the rights of prisoners current, I comb through the pages of the Federal Supplement, the Federal Reporter. I read law review articles. I read decisions of the United States Supreme Court about conditions in our prisons and jails. Reading these cases is a peephole into the secret world of prisons. What I learned this year, and just this year, reading those cases, it told me similar stories that those that Bridget and Emily describe in other contexts. I read this year of prisoners in Texas being held for days in a cell filled with feces and urine. I read a case of 40 to 60 prisoners held in tiny spaces in Hawaii with no toilet or running water, causing them to urinate and defecate in public and in unsanitary conditions. I read a story about a detainee in Ohio who was arrested for petty theft and was identified as a suicide risk, but instead of being given any treatment or any care, he was placed in solitary confinement where he killed himself. Why do we have these outrages? Why are the prisons we have not reflective of our basic values? Prisons, I think, are ignored. The reason for this is that prisons are secret places. They are, as one Supreme Court justice said, out of sight, out of mind. We'd rather forget about them and not care. But Bridget and Emily in this important book have not ignored prisons. And in this chapter, they provide an important service and make a contribution by not ignoring the incarcerated. I wrote last year in an op-ed that we must muster the courage to confront the shame of our prisons and our jails, so that what is happening all over this country ends once and for all. To do that, we have to open our eyes and report the truth. And Bridget and Emily in this important book have done so. And in that process have helped move us closer to the day where we will have prisons that reflect our essential values. So I thank them for writing this important book.
Thank you, Professor Mushland. Next up, we will hear from Professor Michelle Simon.
Thank you very much. So I add my congratulations to Bridget and Emily. And I would like to add that in addition, of course, to them being scholars and writing this important book, they also are mentors. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone to each one of them for questions about how their areas of interest intersect with some of my areas of interest, and giving me advice about articles that I am working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 3 of Emily and Bridget's book, which is on school and menstruation, an area that I have been interested in education law and issues that impact education for a lot of different reasons. I teach a lot of first-year courses, and so issues that impact learning have always concerned me. I was the dean, I served as the dean of the law school, and so I was involved in a lot of issues impacting higher education. And I served on a local school board as a school board trustee and some years president for 21 years, kind of the lifespan of a child. And so I became, of course, very involved with all of the issues facing public education. And then finally, of course, I am a mother. I have 3 children who are now grown, but certainly gave me, fueled my passion for issues impacting education. So chapter 3 of Bridget and Emily's book examines how various cities and states have adopted, mostly through legislative reform, access to free menstrual products in the public schools. So in K through 12 over the last several years. So as if you've been involved with watching the news or reading the paper or any involvement in what's going on in public education, you probably have noticed that local school boards have been turned into the hotspot now of the country's political and cultural debates. So instead of the primary purpose of school boards, which is to make sure that our students are safe and engaged in learning, the debates at school board meetings have centered on the political beliefs of the adults. Opposition to the teaching of critical race theory, of course, no understanding about what critical race theory really is, the banning of books that are denounced as inappropriate or pornographic because they deal with race or LGBTQ plus issues, reproductive freedom, and of course, mandatory vaccinations, masking. And school board members who have alternative views are being threatened with violence, sometimes sexual assaults, and expressions of transphobic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic hatred. Some national politicians have blatantly stated that they will support efforts to select school board members who are in favor of banning books or oppose the teaching of critical race theory in the schools. And of course, we're seeing more and more of that, even as Professor Ben Asher mentioned in the beginning, the assault on our reproductive rights. So that shift has, even in the time within when Emily and Bridget wrote and researched this book until now, has also impacted views towards the availability of menstrual products in school. So for example, New Hampshire, which Emily and Bridget talk about as one of the states that passed legislation in 2019 to provide free menstrual products in public school bathrooms in grades 6 through 12, is now currently considering legislation to reverse that. So my interest really is, how can we use the law to ensure that these kinds of political debates do not result in undermining the equality and dignity of all of our children, whether that has to do with access to hygiene products, access to books, access to reproductive freedom, access to truth about our history, access to bathrooms that correspond to their gender identity, all of those issues that are so prevalent today. And my interest really in that combines what I write about, which is a lot of procedure and litigation, with education law. So how do we balance those issues of federalism and separation of powers and policy to protect all of those interests? How do we construct a lawsuit that's ripe to challenge some of those decisions? And what do we base that lawsuit on? Do we look towards federal law, towards the Constitution? Do we look towards state law? Is it better to, instead of going through the judiciary, does it make more sense to go through the legislative process? These are the kinds of issues that pique my interest, and the kind of issues that Emily and Bridget talk about in the book that makes, I think, the book so exciting, that it's not just here are the problems, but what are the different ways that we can help to make sure that things that our children are protected. I'll end just with a personal story that reading this book reminded me of. So when my son, who is now 30, was in middle school, he hung out with his, little group of friends, as anybody who has a child in middle school knows, both girls and guys. And as school ended one day, he saw one of his friends, who was a girl, crying as she was getting ready and changing into her uniform for a softball game that she had right after school. So he went over to her and asked what the problem was. And she told him that she had just gotten her period and she didn't know what to do. Now, my son grew up with two older sisters and, of course, me in my younger years. And he knew exactly what to do. He ran home. We lived pretty close to the middle school, filled a bag. He knew exactly where to find it, filled a bag with tampons and sanitary napkins and all kinds of other issues, I think Advil too, and ran back to the school to give those products to his friend. And she, of course, was able to use them and continue to attend her softball game. And I think actually, her team won. So that was exciting too. So, we've come, I think, a long way since then, but it's really up to all of us through fighting and articulating our beliefs and writing articles and certainly writing books like this to make sure that it stays that way, that we are making sure that we are leaving people the way that they should be, and that their dignity and equality of all of our children is preserved. So thank you so much, Emily and Bridget, for bringing this to the forefront.
Thanks, Professor Simon. Next, we will hear from Professor Leslie Tenzer. Professor Tenzer.
Hello. All right, so I'm going to take a bit more of a holistic approach to my discussion. I want to again also congratulate Bridget and Emily, and I want to make note of my distinguished, accomplished, and incredibly bright colleagues from whom you've heard today, because they showed that the role of the law professor is not only to help students shape their minds to think like lawyers, but also to help the academy and the judiciary and society at whole to shape their opinions on the way to think about the law. We do the former through the Socratic method. We do the latter by studying important issues and then writing scholarly articles about them. I've been fortunate enough to engage in areas of scholarly writing that interest me greatly. I studied the legality of social media and the importance of affirmative action. I've explored these topics through many articles. Among most recent was an exploration of the importance of adopting a period emoji for purposes of normalizing menstruation. Menstruation Matters, the book we're talking about today, does the deep dive on this issue when speaking about Change.org's leadership in getting the Unicode to adopt a drop of blood emoji. In every article that I've written, and I've written many, I reason through problems like every good student of law. I present a problem, I discuss the history of that problem, I analyze the law, and I present a resolution. And because the areas on which I focus present topics of general interest, many people, most notably Bridget and Emily, as Michelle so eloquently pointed out as mentors, suggested that I collect them into a book. But to be honest, the thought of a legal book on issues like social media or affirmative action didn't really excite me. Now, don't get me wrong, I love nonfiction and I love reading it, but my law review articles just didn't do it for me. In fact, my law review article experience, my experience with nonfiction is that law review articles and legal nonfiction books include gratuitous personal stories, but then they really kind of talk about humanity generally. And so it was with unexpected joy and true delight that I got to read Menstruation Matters, which includes all the makings of a great nonfiction piece of work. I must confess, I expected the book to include a compendium of scholarly law review articles, but I was thrilled to learn that it was quite the opposite. The book educated me on the need for and fight for period equality. It also introduced me to people that I have enjoyed getting to know. I learned about Jennifer Weiss-Wolf and New York City Councilwoman Julissa Perez Copeland, who worked together to make sure New York school students had access to feminine care products, assuring them better concentration and attendance in school. I met sisters-in-law Stephanie Arnold and Sharon Champion, who founded the Homeless Period Project, which donates period packets to people living in homeless shelters and on the street. And I heard the thoughts of an inmate, Chandra Bazelko, who explained how prison officials use the distribution of sanitation products to control inmate behavior. I also got reacquainted with my former employee, Representative Carolyn Maloney, a longtime champion of women's rights. A good work of nonfiction makes the reader care. In their book, Bridget and Emily reel us in beyond a general empathy for period equality by providing us with an intimate portrait of those who suffer from the indignities of period discrimination and those who are championing the cause. Which leads me back to one last reflection of my own work. While each of my articles focuses on a legal problem, their genesis does not come from human stories. There is a defendant whose trial was compromised when one of the jurors hearing his case texted over 7,000 messages to hear her family and friends from a jury box. There's a woman who suffered public humiliation and fear when her husband published threats on Facebook, which she was able to minimize given the public forum on which they appeared. And now, because of Change.org, as Bridget and Emily highlight, a generation of young people will have an emoji to text to their friends when they menstruate. So I guess my takeaway from all of this, and what I think Menstruation Matters really brings home, aside from the topic to which it speaks, is that what we write as legal scholars may matter to the academy, but the value truly lies in telling the stories about people. Yes, we're scholars, but as Menstruation Matters shows us, we are also storytellers, and it's our job to tell the stories that can affect change. Emily and Bridget in their book Menstruation Matters do just that.
Thanks, Professor Tenzer. So now we're going to hear again from our authors. So I pass the podium back to Professors Waldman and Crawford.
Sorry, had to unmute. Okay, I just want to make a few quick remarks. I want to thank everyone who is attending, and especially our colleagues who were so generous, not just to read our book, but then to really think deeply about it and speak to all of you. And one final thought I will leave you with in terms of how my thinking has progressed since I started working on this topic a few years ago. I think before I had thought deeply about the whole topic of menstruation and how the law might treat menstruation, I only had two models in my mind. One of them would be ways that different cultures, legal systems make menstruation matter in ways that hold women back, whether it's different religious traditions, rules in certain countries about the idea that people who are menstruating have to hold back from participating in certain activities, are unclean, things like that. So the idea was that if law recognizes menstruation, that would be bad, that would be used to hold menstruating people and more generally women back from full participation in society. So that's one model. Then another model was just being totally silent about menstruation, completely ignoring it. You have no idea if somebody has their period. It's not something that you talk about, with the idea that that's what would sort of facilitate full participation, just the idea that menstruation doesn't even matter. And I hope what our book shows is that there's really a third way, where we recognize that menstruation can impact people and that the law shouldn't just ignore it, but that if anything, the law's role is to try to make sure that menstruation doesn't hold people back. So it's not about ignoring it. It's not about making it relevant for limiting or stigmatizing reasons, but really recognizing all of the ways that menstruation can affect people and then thinking about legal change that makes sure that it doesn't hold people back. And sometimes that requires affirmative steps, like schools providing students with menstrual products. Same with prisons and public buildings, like employers providing certain accommodations. That's really the ultimate goal of our book, is thinking about how the law can play a role in ensuring full participation for everybody. And so I will stop there.
And I'll only add that working on this book has been a journey and a transformative experience, I think, for us individually as a writer, and also to be in community conversation with our colleagues. Our highest and best aspirations for the law is that the law facilitate justice, regardless of our particular areas of expertise. Justice is an everyday project, and we're delighted to make this contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professors Crawford and Waldman. I'm going to ask all of my colleagues to turn their videos on again, all of our panelists. We have time for maybe one or two questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to every one of them in this program. I will start with a question that's sort of an amalgam of things that have been asked, having to do with a comparative perspective. Where does the United States and its various jurisdictions stand vis-a-vis jurisdictions across the world in terms of period equality? How much? Who do we need to catch up with? And who, if anyone, are we ahead of in terms of the goals that Professor Waldman articulated a moment ago?
So I think Professor Waldman and I are both super interested in the Scotland example. Emily, do you want to fill in a little bit about some of what that fantastic but small and mighty country has done?
Yeah, it's really been remarkable to see what Scotland has done. It started the idea of making period products free in all schools. And then it has extended to the idea of making menstrual products free to everybody who needs them, regardless of age. And what was really fascinating was that this whole initiative, this act, passed at the height of the pandemic. And one of the things that we haven't talked so much about today, but we talk about in our book, is the way that the pandemic actually really raised awareness in people's minds about period poverty, right? That there was something about people's experience of being stuck at home, often even people who could afford products, they either couldn't leave their house, or if they got to the stores were out of them. And it made everyone realize sort of how essential it is to be able to manage menstruation. And that seems to have helped actually expedite what happened in Scotland. It was something that people on both sides, different political views, could all unite around, was this period poverty issue.
Thank you. It seems like we have a question from Professor Chu, is that right?
No, I was hopeful just to provide an additional answer. To note
Please
that
do.
My estimation, regardless of where the U.S. is now, and I sense maybe we're a bit behind, I will say I think we're going to be catching up in part because of the work that Emily, you and Bridget have done. And I will, as a specific example, say I was encouraged, excited to see a student in my climate change law this semester with access to the law review articles that you both have written, write a wonderful paper on menstrual equity in the context of disaster relief after climate exacerbated disasters. And so that, to my mind, is a very specific example of the way that our law will very rapidly be catching up now that you're erasing the silence around these issues.
That's great to hear.
Absolutely. We have one more question. And can we, I know this has been mentioned by a couple of our panelists, but can we elaborate on poverty and on period poverty? And the question specifically asked about coverage by government entitlement programs such as SNAP. To what extent, or where are we there in terms of the subsidizing by the federal government for people who are in poverty? And how well is that aligned with other provision of benefits for people who are living in poverty?
So that is a super important issue. SNAP and WIC, Women, Infants, Children benefits, cannot currently be used to buy menstrual products, no matter how much we understand them to be necessities. There's at least one state that recently has applied for a waiver from the federal program. I have zero hope that a waiver would be granted to allow residents to use SNAP or WIC benefits for that purpose. But I think, as Professor Q mentioned, we have a changing understanding of disaster, poverty, and necessary relief. Congresswoman Grace Meng, who is a great friend to Pace Law School, is one of the sponsors of a Menstrual Equity for All Act that, although not passed in whole, at least in part, has been adopted in other areas, making it possible for FEMA funds, Federal Emergency Management Act funds, to be used to provide, to purchase menstrual products in federally declared disaster areas. So we are chipping away at it slowly. We did have comments in the chat from some international colleagues who are being quoted some large prices for purchase on nyupress.org, and reach out to us, and we'll try to see what we can do there to provide relief of our own kind.
Very good. Yet another thing to thank our authors for. So I'd like to just say that this has been a great conversation, and as I said, the project started with conversation, and now with the finished product, we have even more conversation and the ability to actually take this scholarly idea and help it make change, and really needed and critical change for the lives of, upwards of half of our population. So thanks to our authors, thanks to all of our faculty colleagues for contributing both to the beginning and to the culmination of this project, and for being here today. Thanks to all of our participants. I know many of you are living by the academic calendar, so I especially thank you for taking time out of your finals drafting, final study, or whatever stage you're in terms of your courses, to be here with us today. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.